Oh, look at that. Convenient. That is convenient as hell. Oh, hey, we got people filing in. Cool. Gonna start in probably just a little while, so feel free to grab a cup of tea, grab a cup of coffee, whatever your favorite beverage is. Grab an adult beverage if you'd like one. But we will be. I'm gonna give everybody just kind of like a few minutes to start coming in. Feel free to use the chat. I will be keeping an eye on that as well. And guess what? Bang, got the book right here. And of course, right over here, none other than Kitty. Say hello, everybody. Say hi. Say
Hi. Hi. Everybody.
He's like, put me down. Put me the fuck down. You're not gonna get on there. That's not gonna happen, bud. Nope. Okay. So I am on a laptop and just kind of sitting here on the couch, the same couch on which I'm doing the readings. I'm sitting on it right now. You just kind of seeing everything from a different angle. This time the camera's aimed at me, and not my coffee table. And of course I got Kitty, Mr. Bub, whom you've all seen on my videos. He comes in quite a bit. So, anybody given any thought to which story they'd like to hear? I was actually going to pick Cinderella, but I remembered I did want you to bring your kids and family, and I don't know for sure, and it's been a long time, but if I'm not mistaken, that particular story featured foot mutilation. Don't think the kids need to know that one. Oh my God. Right? And I got tea brewing over there, so give me a minute. I'm gonna go grab that tea. I've got my Earl Grey just steeping and ready. I'm gonna throw a little honey in it and be right back. You wanna talk to everybody? There's like a live stream going on. You're part of it, bud. No, I'm not kidding you. Yeah. That's you. Here we go. Bub stream. There you go. See? Look, right here. Right here. Yeah, look right there. Why are you trying to bite? Don't bite. What are you looking at? There's nothing over there. See? See? That's you right there. See that? All right. And we lost everyone. Well, I don't know if anybody's going to turn out for this, but you know what? Fuck it. I said I was going to keep it clean. There I go. Through an F-bomb already. I don't know if I can actually edit. Can I edit that? I can? I can edit that? See, what am I going to do to edit? Oh. Can't do that. Okay. Cancel that. Okay, well, can't edit that out. Can't get that back. Okay, so I'll tell you what. Let's just go ahead and get started, right? All right, so let's see. We had one person pop on just now. Nobody on. Okay. So I guess just for now, I'm kind of like looking around, seeing what's what. Oh, hey. There we go. Nice, nice. So, I'm going to go ahead and mark that as red. And again, this over here. Dang. Delete. Yeah, let's delete that. There we go. Raven tells you stories. Okay, cool. I don't like the way my face looks on that, but okay. I don't like the way my face looks from this angle, dude. All right. But anyway, getting right down to it, since I was supposed to start like 18 minutes ago. The thing that most people think about when they hear fairy tales, they hear that stuff that Disney talks about, and honestly, that is just that's not them. What Disney has done is they've largely sanitized them, and when I say sanitize them, I'm talking like they've sterilized the fairy tale. The fairy tales served a few different functions. Number one, they served as like cautionary tales, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. They had, some of them had moral lessons to teach, so on and so forth. But they were also, and this will prove that prohibition never ever works. What they did was when the Christians began to spread out, when the Roman Catholic Church began to expand its sort of reach. What they did was they didn't go to the populations first. What they did was they went to kings and rulers of the various realms, and basically said, okay, look, we've got this nation. We're about to get these nations here. We're going to get more nations after that. if you convert, so they went down the line. The more people they got, they were, well, if you convert, then you'll have a much easier time doing business in these areas. If you don't, we will exclude you. And that's called excommunication. We will cut you off and you'll have nothing. Is that starting to sound just a little bit familiar? Okay. So what would happen is these kings or heads of state would, of course, acquiesce, and then churches would be erected. Now, once you have those churches erected, then, of course, comes down the mandates to the people. Then it's, hey, we've got this great new religion. Go ahead and convert to us. And some would. And, of course, it's not as many as they'd hope. So the next thing you know, well, if you don't convert to this religion, you'll burn in hell. And hell is a place of fiery eternal torment. Well, now you've got more people coming in because they're scared to fucking death. Keep saying I said I was going to keep the language to a minimum. So far, I've dropped 2 F-bombs. Okay, let's just leave it at 2, hopefully. So the next thing that would happen is, okay, if you don't convert, we'll kill you. So a lot of these like religions that were there regionally had to move underground. And most of them at the time were kind of like passed through oral tradition. What was the stories of the gods became these. Not even kidding you. This big ass collection right here. Here we go. I'm dropping an A-bomb too. So this big old collection of stories here. Big old honking collection of stories. Not just fairy tales. A lot of these are retellings of stories of the gods. And a lot of these stories do have pagan origins. So this shows you, this is an example of why prohibition doesn't work. The stories that they told their children were at first of these gods, these beings, Zeus, Apollo, Thor, Cernunnos, so on and so forth. Mithras, I think, Horus, Ra, Isis, so on and so forth. Those stories ended up changing. And depending on where you were in the world or who was telling them, eventually they got collected and written down. And we would use these to tell, we used sort of, as they went down the line, they got more cleaned up, more sanitized. And we would use these to tell our, kind of lull our kids to sleep. Okay, well, here's a story of this character. Here's the moral of that story. But the kid would probably be passed out before you even get to it. So just as an example, I decided I was going to pull this out. Never got any feedback on which one to read. I'd initially thought of picking Cinderella, but like I said earlier, there's foot mutilation, so I didn't really think that was a good one. However, I have never really read The Frog King, and I thought that would be a good one. The Beast is also in here. Three Little Pigs, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, The Troll's Daughter, The Nightingale, The Wounded Lion, Steadfast Tin Soldier, Sparrow with the Slit Tongue, Cinderella, Little Mermaid, Master Cat or Puss in Boots. That's also in here. What else do we have? We have Thumbelina, The Billy Goat and the King. What else we got? The King Who Would Be Stronger Than Fate. I got kind of half a mind to read that one, to be honest with you. That actually looks pretty good. There's also The History of Jack the Giant Killer. I think that's also Jack and the Beanstalk. I say let's check out The King Who Would Be Stronger Than Fate. What do you think? Something a little, something we haven't really seen before. And live chat's going, so feel free to pipe in. I haven't exactly chosen yet. There's Hansel and Gretel, that's in here. The Girl Who Trod on a Loaf, I don't know what that's about. Actually, that's one I've never really heard before. But I do really have an affinity for these fairy tales, and that's going to be kind of evident on Friday morning. So be sure to tune in then. Okay, so let's see about that king who would be stronger than fate, number 241. 241, right? Not too far from it now. Here we go. So, this is from the Brown Fairy book. This is the king who would be stronger than fate. And remember, I'm reading fairy tales, not political speeches. I know the two are normally confused. Just wanted to throw that out there. So, here it is. The king who would be stronger than fate from the Brown Fairy book. Once upon a time, far away in the East Country, there lived a king who loved hunting so much that when once there was a deer in sight, he was careless of his own safety. Indeed, he often became quite separated from his nobles and attendants, and in fact was particularly fond of lonely adventures. Another of his favorite amusements was to give out that he was not well and could not be seen, and then, with the knowledge of only his faithful Grand Vizier, was to disguise himself as a peddler, load a donkey with cheap wares, and travel about. In this way, he found out what the common people said about him and how his judges and governors fulfilled their duties. One day, his queen presented him with a baby daughter as beautiful as dawn, and the king himself was so happy and delighted that for a whole week he forgot to hunt and spent the time in public and private rejoicing. Not long afterward, however, he went out after some deer, which were to be found in the far corner of his forest. In the course of in the course of the beat, his dogs disturbed a beautiful snow-white stag, and directly he saw it, the king determined that he would have it at any cost. So he put the spurs to his horse and followed it as hard as he could gallop. Of course, all of his attendants followed at the best speed that they could manage, but the king was so splendidly mounted, and the stag was so swift that at the end of the hour, the king found that only his favorite hound and himself were in the chase, and all the rest were far, far behind and out of sight. Nothing daunted, however, he went on till he perceived that he was entering a valley with a great rocky mountain on all sides, and that his horse was getting very tired and trembled at every stride. Worse than all evening was already drawing on, and the sun would soon set. In vain he sent arrow after the beautiful stag. Every shot fell short or went wide of the mark, and at last, just as darkness was setting in, he lost sight altogether of the beast. By this time his horse could hardly move from fatigue. His hound staggered, panting along beside him. He was far away amongst mountains where he had never been before, and had quite missed his way. I'm going to stammer a bit. And not a human creature was in sight. All this was very discouraging, but the king would not have minded if he had not lost that beautiful stag. That troubled him a great deal, but he never worried over what he could not help, so he got down from his horse, slipped his arm through the bridle, and led the animal along a rough path in hopes of discovering some shepherd's hut, or at least a cave or shelter under some rock, where he might pass the night. Presently, he heard the sound of rushing water and made toward it. He toiled over a steep rocky shoulder of a hill, and there, just below him, was a stream dashing down a precipitous glen, almost beneath his feet, twinkling and flickering from the level of the torrent, was as dim as the light of a lamp. Toward this light the king with his horse and hound made his way, sliding and stumbling down a steep stony path. At the bottom the king found a narrow grassy ledge by the brink of the stream, across which the light from a crude lantern in the mount of a cave shed a broad beam of uncertain light. At the edge of the stream sat an old hermit with a long white beard, who neither spoke nor moved as the king approached, but sat throwing into the stream dry leaves which lay scattered on the ground near him. "Peace be upon you," said the king, giving his usual country salutation. "And upon you peace," answered the hermit, but still he never looked up. nor stopped what he was doing. For a minute or two, the king stood watching him. He noticed that the hermit threw 2 leaves in at a time, and watched them attentively. Sometimes both were carried rapidly down the stream. Sometimes only one leaf was carried off, and the other, after whirling slowly round and round on the edge of the current, would come circling back on an eddy to the hermit's feet. At other times, both leaves were held in the backward eddy and failed to reach the main current of the noisy stream. "What are you doing?" asked the king at last, and the hermit replied, "He was reading the fates of men. Everyone's fate," he said, "was settled from the beginning, and whatever it were, there was no escape from it." The king laughed. "I care little," he said, "what my fate may be, but I should be curious to know the fate of my daughter." "I cannot say," answered the hermit. "Do you not know, then?" demanded the king. "I might know," returned the hermit. "It is not always wisdom to know much." And there's some havamal for you. But the king was not content with this reply, and began to press the old man to say what he knew, which for a long time he would not do. At last, however, the king urged him so greatly that he said, "The king's daughter will marry the son of a poor slave girl called Peruna, who belongs to the king of the land of the north. There is no escaping from fate." The king was wild with anger at hearing these words, but he was also very tired. So he only laughed and answered that he hoped that there would be a way out of that fate anyhow. Then he asked the hermit if he could shelter him and his beasts for the night, and the hermit said, "Yes." So very soon the king had watered and tethered his horse, and after a supper of bread and parched peas lay down in the cave with his hound at his feet, and tried to go to sleep. But instead of sleeping, he only lay awake and thought of the hermit's prophecy, and the more he thought of it, the angrier he felt, until he gnashed his teeth and declared that it should never, never come true. Morning came, and the king woke up, pale and sulky, and after learning from the hermit which path to take, was soon mounted and found his way home without much difficulty. Directly he reached his palace, and he wrote a letter to the king of the land of the north, begging him as a favor to sell him his favorite slave girl, Peruna, and her son, saying that if he consented, he would send a messenger to receive them at the river which divided the kingdoms. For 5 days he awaited the reply, and he hardly slept or ate, and he was so cross as could be all the time. On the 5th day his messenger returned with a letter to say that the king of the land of the north would not sell, but he would give the king the slave girl and her son. The king was overjoyed. He sent his grand vizier and told him that he was going on one of his lonely expeditions, and the wazir must invent some excuse to account for his absence. Next, he disguised himself as an ordinary messenger, mounted a swift camel, and sped away to the place where the slave girl was to be handed over to him. When he got there, he gave the messengers who brought her a letter of thanks and a handsome present for their master and rewards for themselves. And then, without delay, he took the poor woman and her tiny baby boy up to his camel and rode off to a wild desert. After riding for a day and a night, almost without stopping, he came to a great cave where he made the woman dismount, and taking her and the baby into the cave, he drew his sword and with one blow chopped her head off. And although his anger made him cruel enough for anything so dreadful, the king felt he could not turn his great sword on the helpless baby, who he was sure must soon die in the solitary place without its mother. So he left it in that cave where it was, and mounting his camel, rode home as fast as he could. Now in a small village in his kingdom, let's see, I'm going to take a quick break. Let's see. Hey, everybody, what's up? What's happening? What's going on? Keep reading. Thank you. The king should go. All right. So now in a small village, his kingdom, there lived an old widow who had no children or relations of any kind. She made her living mostly by selling the milk of a flock of goats, but she was very, very poor, not very strong, and often used to wonder how she would live if she got too weak or ill to attend to her goats. Every morning she drove the goats out into the desert to graze on the shrubs and the bushes which grew there, and every evening they came home themselves to be milked and to be shut up safely for the night. One evening, the old woman was astonished to find that her very best nanny goat returned without a drop of milk. She thought that some naughty boy or girl was playing a trick upon her, and had caught the goat on its way home and stolen all the milk. But when evening after evening the goat remained almost dry, she determined to find out who the thief was. So the next day she followed the goats at a distance and watched them while they grazed. At length in the afternoon, the old woman noticed this particular nanny goat stealing off by herself away from the herd, and she at once went after her. On and on the goat walked for some way, and they disappeared into a cave in the rocks. The old woman followed the goat into the cave, and then what should she see but the animal giving her milk to the little baby boy, whilst on the ground nearby lay the sad remains of the baby's dead mother. Wondering and frightened, the old woman thought that at last this little baby might be a son to her in her old age, and he would grow up in time to come be her comfort and support. So she carried home the baby to her hut, and the next day she took a spade to the cave and dug a grave where she buried the poor mother. Years passed, and the baby grew up into a fine, handsome young lad, as daring as he was beautiful, and as industrious as he was brave. One day, when the boy whom the woman had named Nur Mohammed was about 17 years old, he was coming home from a day's work in the fields when he saw a strange donkey eating the cabbages in the garden which surrounded their little cottage. Seizing a big stick, he began to beat the intruder and to drive him out of his garden. A neighbor passing by called out to him, "Hey, I say, why are you beating the peddler's donkey like that?" "The peddler should keep him from eating my cabbages," said Nur. "If he comes in this evening here again, I'll cut his tail off for him." Whereupon he went off indoors, whistling cheerfully. It happened that the neighbor was one of those people who would make mischief by talking too much. So meeting the peddler in the sarai or inn that evening, he told him what had occurred, and added, "Yes," and the young spitfire said that if beating the donkey would not do, he would beat you also and cut your nose off for a thief. A few days later, the peddler having moved on, two men appeared in the village inquiring who it was that had threatened to ill-treat and to murder an innocent peddler. They declared that the peddler, in fear for his life, had complained to the king, that they had been sent to bring the lawless person who had said these things before the king himself. Of course, they soon found out about the donkey eating Nur Muhammad's cabbages, and about that young man's hot words. But although the lad had assured them he never said anything about murdering anyone, they replied they were ordered to arrest him and bring him to trial before the king. So in spite of his protests and the wails of his mother, he was carried off and in due time brought before the king. Of course, Nur Muhammad never guessed that the supposed peddler happened to be the king himself. But as he was very angry at what he had been told, he declared that he was going to make an example of this young man and intended to teach him that even poor traveling peddlers could get justice in his country and be protected from such lawlessness. However, just as he was going to pronounce some heavy sentence, there was a stir in the court, and up came Nur Muhammad's old mother, weeping and lamenting and begging to be heard. The king ordered her to speak, and she began to plead for the boy, declaring how good he was, how he was the support of her old age, and if he were imprisoned, she would die. The king asked her who she was, and she replied that she was his mother. "His mother," said the king, "you are too old, surely, to have so young a son." The woman, in her frightened distress, confessed the whole story of how she found the baby, and how she rescued and brought him up, and ended by beseeching the king for mercy. It is easy to guess how, as the story came out, the king looked more and more pale and more grim, until at last he was half fainting with rage and astonishment. This, then, was the baby he had left to die after cruelly murdering his mother. Surely fate might have spared him this. He wished he had had sufficient excuse to put the boy to death, for the old hermit's prophecy came back to him as strongly as ever, and yet the young man had done nothing to deserve such a punishment. Everyone would call him a tyrant if he were to give such an order. In fact, he dared not try it. At length, he collected himself enough to say, "If this young man will enlist in my army, I will let him off. We have need of such as him, and little discipline will do him good." Still, the old woman pleaded that she could not live without her son, and was nearly as terrified at the idea of his becoming a soldier as she was the thought of his being put in prison. But at length the king determined to get the youth into his clutches, pacified her by promising her a pension large enough to keep her in comfort, and Nur Muhammad, to his own great delight, was duly enrolled in the king's army. As a soldier, Nur Muhammad seemed to be in luck. He was rather surprised, but much pleased to find that he was always one of the chosen when any difficult or dangerous enterprise was afoot. Although he had the narrowest escapes on some occasions, still the very desperateness of the situations in which he found himself gave him special chances of displaying his courage. And as he was also modest and generous, he became a favorite with his officers and comrades. Thus it was not surprising that before very long he became enrolled amongst the picked men of the king's bodyguard. The fact is that the king had hoped to have gotten him killed in some fight or another, but seeing that on the contrary he thrived on the hard knocks, he was now determined to try more direct and desperate methods. One day, soon after Nur Muhammad had entered the king's bodyguard, he was selected to be one of the soldiers told off to escort the king through the city. The procession was marching on quite smoothly when a man armed with a dagger rushed out of an alley straight toward the king. Nur Muhammad, who was the nearest of the guards, threw himself in the way and received the stab that had been apparently intended for the king. Luckily, the blow was a hurried one, and the dagger glanced on his breastbone, so that although he received a severe wound, his youth and strength quickly got the better of it. The king was, of course, obliged to take some notice of this brave deed, and as a reward made him one of his own attendants. After this, the strange adventures of the young man passed through were endless. Officers of the bodyguard were often sent on all sorts of secret and difficult errands, and such errands had a curious way of becoming necessary when Nur Muhammad was on duty. Once, while he was taking a journey, a footbridge gave way under him, and once he was attacked by armed robbers. A rock rolled down upon him in a mountain pass. A heavy stone coping fell from a roof at his feet in a narrow city alley. And although Nur Muhammad began to think that somewhere or another he had made an enemy, he was still light-hearted, and thought did not trouble him much. He escaped somehow every time and felt amused rather than anxious about the next adventure. It was the custom in that city that the officer for the day of the palace guards should receive food, all his food direct from the king's kitchen. One day when Nur Muhammad's turn came to be on duty, he was sitting down to a delicious stew that had been sent from the palace when one of those gaunt, hungry dogs, which in eastern countries run about in the streets, poked his nose in at the open guardroom door, looked at Nur Muhammad with mouth watering and nostrils working. The kind-hearted young man plucked a lump of meat, went to the door, and threw it outside to him. The dog pounced upon it and gulped it down greedily, and just as it was turning to go, it staggered, fell, rolled over, and died. Nur Muhammad, who had been lazily watching him, stood still for a moment, and then he came back whistling softly. He gathered up the rest of his dinner and carefully wrapped it to carry away and bury it somewhere. Then he sent back the empty plates. How furious the king was when, at the next morning's durbar, Nur Muhammad appeared before him, fresh, alert, and smiling as usual. He was determined, however, to try once more, and bidding the young man to come into his presence that evening, gave orders he was to carry out a secret dispatch to the governor of a distant province. "Make your preparations at once," he added, "and be ready to start in the morning. I myself will deliver you the papers at the last moment." Now, this province was 4 or 5 days' journey from the palace, and the governor of it was the most faithful servant the king had. He could be silent as the grave, and prided himself on his obedience. While he was old and tried servant of the king's, his wife had been almost a mother to the young princess ever since the queen had died some years before. It happened that a little before time the princess had been sent away for her health to another remote province. And while she was there, her old friend, the governor's wife, had begged her to come away and stay with them as soon as she could. The princess accepted gladly and was actually staying in the governor's house at the very time when the king made up his mind to send Nur Muhammad there with a mysterious dispatch. According to orders, Nur Muhammad presented himself early the next morning at the king's private apartments. His best horse was saddled, food placed in the saddlebag, and some money tied up in his waistband. He was ready to start. The king handed him over a sealed packet, him to give it himself, desiring him to give it himself only into the hands of the governor and to no one else. Nur Muhammad hid it carefully in his turban, swung himself into the saddle, and 5 minutes later rode out to the city gates to set out on his long journey. The weather was very hot, but Nur Muhammad thought that the sooner his precious letter was delivered, the better, so that by dint of riding most of each night and resting only in the hottest part of the day, he found himself by noon on the third day approaching the town which was his final destination. Not a soul was to be seen anywhere, and Nur Muhammad, stiff, dry, thirsty, and tired, looked longingly over the wall into the gardens, marked the fountains and the green grass, the shady apricot orchards, and giant mulberry trees, and wished he were there. At length he reached the castle gates, and was at once admitted. As he was in the uniform of the king's bodyguard, the governor was resting, the soldier said, and could not be seen until evening. So Nur Muhammad handed over his horse to an attendant, and wandered down into the lovely gardens he had seen from the road. He sat down in the shade to rest himself, flung himself on his back, and watched the birds twittering and chattering in the streets above him. Through the branches he could see great patches of sky where the kites wheeled and circled incessantly with shrill whistling cries. Bees buzzed over the flowers with a soothing sound, and in a few minutes Nur Muhammad was fast asleep. Every day through the heat of the afternoon, the governor and his wife also used to lie down for 2 or 3 hours in their own rooms, and so, for the matter of, did most people in the palace. But the princess, like many other girls, was restless and preferred to wander around the garden rather than rest on a pile of soft cushions. What a torment her stout old attendants and servants sometimes thought of her when she insisted on staying awake and making them chatter or do something when they could hardly keep their eyes open. Sometimes, however, the princess would pretend to go to sleep, and then, after all her women had gladly followed her example, she would get up, go out by herself, her veil hanging loosely about her. If she was discovered, her old hostess scolded her severely, but the princess only laughed and did the same thing the next time. This very afternoon, the princess had left all her women asleep, and after trying in vain to amuse herself indoors, she had slipped out into the great garden and rambled about in her favorite nooks and corners, feeling quite safe, as there was not a creature to be seen. Suddenly, on turning a corner, she stopped in surprise, for before her lay a man fast asleep. In a hurry, she almost tripped over him, but there he was, a young man, tanned and dusty with travel, in the uniform of an officer of the king's guard. One of the few faults of this lovely princess was a devouring curiosity, and she lived such an idle life that she had plenty of time to be curious. Out of one of the folds of this young man's turban there peeped the corner of a letter. She wondered what the letter was, whom it was for. She drew the veil a little closer and stole across on tiptoe and caught hold of the corner of the letter. Then she pulled it a little, then just a little more. A great big seal came into view, which she saw to be her father's, and at the sight of it she paused for a minute, half ashamed of what she was doing. But the pleasure of taking the letter, which was not meant for her, was more than she could resist, and in another moment it was in her hand. All at once she remembered how it would be the death to this poor officer if he lost the letter, and at all hazards she must put it back again. But this was not so easy, and moreover the letter in her hand burnt her with longing to be read and to see what was inside. She examined the seal. It was sticky with being exposed to the hot sun, and very little effort it parted from the paper. She opened the letter and read it. And this was what was written: "Behead the messenger who brings this letter secretly and at once. Ask no questions." The girl grew pale. What a shame, she thought. She would not let a handsome young fellow like this be beheaded, but how to prevent it was not quite clear at the moment. Some plan had to be invented, and she wished to lock herself in where no one could interrupt her, as might easily happen in the garden. So she crept softly to her room, took a piece of paper, and wrote upon it, "Marry the messenger who brings this letter to the princess openly at once. Ask no questions." And even contrived to work the seals off the original letter and fix them to this one so that no one could tell, unless they examined it closely, that it had ever been opened. Looked back, shaking with fear and excitement, to where the young officer still lay asleep, thrust the letter into the fold of his turban, and hurried back to her room. It was done. Late in the afternoon, Nur Muhammad woke, and making sure that the precious dispatch was still safe, he went off to get ready for his audience with the governor. As soon as he was ushered into his presence, he took the letter from his turban and placed it in the governor's hands according to orders. When he had read it, the governor was certainly a little astonished, but was told in the letter, "Ask no questions," and he knew how to obey orders. He sent for his wife and told her to get the princess ready to be married at once. "Nonsense," his wife said. "What in the world do you mean?" "These are the king's commands," he answered. "Go and do as I bid you. The letter says at once, and ask no questions. The marriage, therefore, must take place this evening." In vain his wife did urge every objection. The more she argued, the more determined was her husband. "I know how to obey orders," he said, "and these are as plain as the nose on my face." So the princess was summoned, and somewhat to their surprise, she seemed to take the news very calmly. Next, Nur Muhammad was informed, and he was greatly startled. But of course, he could be delighted at the great and unexpected honor which he thought the king had done him. Then all the castle was turned upside down, and when the news spread in the town, that was turned upside down as well. Everyone ran everywhere, tried to do everything at once. In the middle of it all, the old governor went about with his hair standing on end, muttering something about obeying orders. And so the marriage was celebrated. There was a great feast in the castle, and another in the soldiers' barracks, and illuminations all over the town and the beautiful gardens. And all the people declared that such wonderful sights had never been seen, and talked about to the ends of their lives. The next day the governor dispatched the princess and her bridegroom to the king with a troop of horsemen splendidly dressed, and sent a mounted messenger on before them with a letter giving the account of the marriage to the king. When the king got the governor's letter, he grew so red in the face that everyone thought he was going to go apoplectic. They were all very anxious to know what had happened, but he rushed off and locked himself into a room where he ranted and raved until he was tired. And then, after a while, he began to think he had better make the best of it, especially as the old governor had been clever enough to send back his letter, and the king was pretty sure that this was in the princess's handwriting. He was fond of his daughter, and though she had behaved badly, he did not wish to cut her head off. He didn't want the people to know the truth because it would make him look foolish. In fact, the more he considered the matter, the more he felt he would be wise to put a good face on it, and to let people suppose that he had really brought about the marriage of his own free will. So when the young couple arrived, the king received them with all state and gave his son-in-law a province to govern. Nur Muhammad soon proved himself as able and honorable a governor as he was a brave soldier, and when the old king died, he became king in his place and reigned long and happily. Nur Muhammad's old mother lived for a long time in her son's palace and died in peace. The princess, his wife, although she had gotten her husband by a trick, found that she could not trick him, and so she never tried, but busied herself in teaching her children and scolding her maids. As for the old hermit, no trace of him was ever discovered, but the cave is there, and the leaves lie thick in front of it unto this day. See that? That's a happily ever after. I can tell you one thing though, that's not typical. It's not typical for happily ever after in just about any fairy tale. So let's see what we got. Can I read Harry Potter? Can I read Harry Potter? Can you read Mein Kampf? Okay. Yeah, sure. Dude, such a wholesome person. You deserve so many more viewers. I'm anything but wholesome, but I thank you. Let's see, we got a whole bunch of people in here. Oh, naughty boy, yeah. The king should kill it. Okay. I should have known the very person who said the king should kill the baby is same guy. Can you read Mein Kampf, please? Yeah, okay. Fairy tales, dude. Okay. Jeez. Read Born a Crime. Oh man, come on. Yeah. And that is the audience for you. But anyway, I think one's enough for now. Let me know if you want to keep doing this. Obviously, first live stream, we're going to be making some. We're going to have some pretty strange times. In any case, this will remain up. Comment down below. Catch me on Twitter. Catch me on speakermindhere.com, highfivin.com, cloudhub.com as well, pill.net. You can find me all over there under the same name, Raven Wolfgar. You just do a search for Raven Wolfgar, you'll find me. My username on Twitter is different, okay? But go to any of my public, readings. You'll find all the places you can hang out with me. But I think I'm gonna wrap this up. We've been going about like almost a little over 45 minutes. So I think it was good enough. Got a like here. Got some people in the chat, and love to do this again with you. In the meantime, I'm out of here. I'm gonna go have some tea. Gonna try to. I don't know if I can edit those F-bombs out. I think it just. Oops. Live and learn. It's the first one. So anyway, see you guys later. Shine on.